Okay, let's dive in. Today, we are exploring a really fascinating question in developmental psychology. How exactly does a child's developing mind, get its head around the concept of gender?
What does it mean to be a boy? What does it mean to be a girl?
Exactly. And if you're a psychology student trying to figure this out, well, this deep dive is pretty much custom built for you. We're cutting straight to the cognitive theories that tackle this.
That's right. We've looked at the source material you've shared, and it gives a really solid grounding here. From Piaget's foundational ideas right through key theories like Kohlberg's gender constancy and gender schema theory.
Uh-huh.
So our mission here is basically to distill the absolute core insights, maybe some surprising twists in the research, and everything you really need to grasp how children's thinking shapes their understanding of gender.
So think of it like this. We've got this stack of notes, articles, research summaries right here. Forget wading through it all yourself. We're going to unpack these cognitive theories, get the big ideas, look at what the evidence actually says, and figure out where they shine and, well, where they might fall short.
Get ready to see gender development not just as something kids pick up from the world, but something their minds are actively, working to figure out.
So where do we start? To understand how kids think about gender.
You first need to understand how children think, period. And that really starts with the bedrock of developmental psychology, Jean Piaget.
Right.
His fundamental insight, and it's a big one, was that children don't just know less than adults. They think in fundamentally different ways at different ages.
It's not just acquiring more
No,
facts.
it's like a whole different operating system for the mind at different points.
Exactly. Their brains are structured differently. Piaget mapped this out, didn't he? Those four big stages, if you're studying psych, you definitely know these.
Oh yeah, sensory motor for babies, learning through senses, actions.
Then preoperational symbolic thought emerges, but logic is wobbly egocentrism and all that.
Right. Then concrete operational, they get logic, but only with concrete things they can see or touch.
And finally, formal operational, abstract thinking, adolescence onwards.
And a really critical concept Piaget gave us, which is totally central to these gender theories, is the schema.
The mental template idea.
Yeah, think of it like a mental filing system, a framework your brain uses to organize information. The classic example is a kid's dog schema. Maybe it includes forelegs, fur, barks.
Wag's tail, their internal model for dog.
Exactly. It helps them make sense of the world.
And the big link here, connecting Piaget to gender, is that cognitive theorists argue that understanding gender, what it is, what it means, what behaviors go with it, it develops right alongside these broader cognitive abilities.
So it gets more complex, less rigid, more accurate as their overall thinking matures through those Piagetian stages.
Okay, so Piaget sets the stage. Who takes it specifically into gender?
Well, building directly on this idea of cognitive development, the first major figure was Lawrence Kohlberg back in the 1960s. He proposed that children achieve a full understanding of gender constancy, but they do it by moving through three distinct sequential stages.
Okay, stage one.
Stage one, he called it gender identity. Usually pops up around ages 2 to 3.
Right.
At this point, a child can label themselves correctly, I'm a boy or I'm a girl. They can often label others too, based on really obvious cues like hair or clothes.
But, and this is the kicker, right? They have zero understanding that gender is permanent.
Absolutely none. The source gives a really vivid picture. A 3-year-old might genuinely believe that if you put on a dress, you become a different gender.
Or a man with long hair is a woman.
Yeah, their understanding is just superficial, tied completely to what they see right now. It's not a fixed characteristic yet in their minds.
Okay, so they can identify, but it's fragile. What's the next step? Stage two.
That's stage 2. Gender stability. Typically seen between, say, 4 and 7 years old. Now, they've made a cognitive leap. They understand that gender stays the same over time.
Good.
They get that they were a boy-girl, they are a boy-girl now, and they will grow up to be a man-woman.
So their own gender identity is stable across their lifespan. That sounds like progress.
It is progress, but there's still a limitation.
Ah, okay. What's the catch?
While it's stable over time, it's not yet understood as constant across situations.
Explain that difference.
Well, the source gives another great example. A 5-year-old understands she'll always be female, but she might see a man doing something traditionally feminine, like cooking dinner,
Yeah.
and think he's somehow becoming more feminine in that moment. Or that she could become more masculine just by playing with trucks.
So gender is still tied to activities or appearance in the moment, even if they know they'll be a man or woman later.
Exactly. It's stable longitudinally, like you said, but not contextually. Not yet.
That's a really interesting distinction. So when does the full, complete understanding finally click?
That's stage 3. Gender constancy, usually achieved around age 6, or maybe a bit older. This is the big aha moment Kohlberg talked about.
Okay.
The child now fully understands that gender is fixed, it's permanent, it's a biological reality, and it does not change based on clothes, activities, or how you look.
So now a 7-year-old sees a man in a dress and knows he's still a man.
Right. Or a girl playing football is definitely still a girl.
The concept has finally solidified as an unchanging characteristic.
Precisely. And here's Kohlberg's really big claim. Achieving gender constancy is the trigger. It's what makes children truly motivated to seek out and engage in gender-appropriate behaviors.
Before that, maybe they imitate, but they don't really get the significance.
That was his argument. It's only after they understand gender is permanent that they see the point of aligning their behavior with their gender category. It becomes meaningful then.
That's a strong claim that understanding causes the motivation to conform. What did the research actually find? Does it back that up?
Well, there's definitely support for the stage progression. Thompson, way back in '75, found evidence for stage 1 timing 3-year-olds were better at identifying their own gender than 2-year-olds. That fits.
Okay. And what about the sequence?
That's where the classic Slabby and Frey study from 1975 comes in. It's really key here. They designed experiments to test the stages, and they did find kids moving through them in the predicted order. You couldn't seem to skip stages.
So identity, then stability, then constancy.
Exactly. And what's more, they found that children who had achieved constancy actually paid significantly more attention to videos showing same-sex models.
So that lines up with Kohlberg's idea that understanding drives interest, right? Drives attention.
It does seem to support that link, but there's a but.
Always a but in psychology research.
Yeah. What's fascinating about Slabby and Frey, and something the source points out as a potential challenge to Kohlberg, is that they found kids might achieve constancy earlier than Kohlberg predicted. Not necessarily maybe closer to age 5 sometimes.
Okay, so the order holds up, but maybe the timing is a bit off. Kids might get it sooner.
Potentially, yeah. And adding more weight to the order being universal, there was the Monroe et al. Study in 1984.
What did they do?
They looked at kids in 4 really different cultures. Kenya, Belize, American Samoa, Nepal. Very different places.
Wow, okay.
And they found the same basic stage progression everywhere. Gender identity, stability, constancy. That suggests there might be something fundamentally cognitive about this pathway, regardless of culture.
That cross-cultural evidence is pretty compelling for the sequence itself. But you mentioned criticisms earlier. Besides the age thing, what else?
Well, one significant critique is about differences within the process. Slabby and Frey, while supporting the stages, also found sex differences. Boys often seemed more focused on gender information than girls. Kohlberg's theory describes this universal cognitive process, but it doesn't really have much to say about why there might be sex differences in interest or motivation along the way.
Right. It explains the how of understanding, but not the why of maybe different levels of engagement or focus between boys and girls.
Exactly. And another big one is that the theory is pretty narrow, isn't it? It focuses almost entirely on the child's internal thinking, their cognition.
Yeah, it feels like it leaves a lot out.
It really does. It largely overlooks the huge influence of, well, everything else. Social factors, parents, peers, media, culture reinforcing things, and biological factors like hormones, which we now know play a role.
So contemporary views see those as crucial pieces, but Kohlberg's original theory didn't really integrate them.
Not really. It describes the cognitive steps, but it doesn't fully explain what might be driving those steps or what other forces are shaping gender development at the same time.
It feels a bit like that chicken and egg problem again. Does understanding constancy cause you to care more about gender roles, or do social pressures make you care more, and that maybe pushes you to figure out constancy faster? Kohlberg really leaned on the first one.
He did. Which brings us very neatly to the next major cognitive approach, gender schema theory, proposed by Martin and Halvorson in 1981.
And this theory tries to address some of those gaps.
It tries to, yeah.
Yeah.
It was designed specifically to take Kohlberg's cognitive ideas, but integrate them more effectively with insights from social learning theory. It's arguably a more dynamic model.
Okay, so how does it work? What exactly is a gender schema in this context?
So think back to Piaget's general schema idea, those mental frameworks. Gender schema theory says children develop a specific and really powerful schema just for gender.
A mental filter for gender stuff.
Exactly. The source describes it really well, like a mental filing system they build. They start organizing all the information they encounter about what's seen as appropriate for boys and for girls.
So like two main folders.
Basically, yeah.
Yeah.
Things related to boys, men, and things related to girls, women. They start sorting things into these metal boxes.
And once they have these folders, these schemas, they start processing the world through them.
Precisely. And this leads to what's called the in-group, out-group process. It's a key part of the theory.
In-group, out-group.
Children pay much more attention to information that fits their own gender schema. That's the in-group. They actively seek it out. They process it more deeply. They remember it better, and they tend to value it more.
So a boy sees a toy truck, the boy schema folder kind of lights up.
Yeah, exactly. He pays extra attention. Information that fits the schema for the other gender, the outgroup, is often ignored or forgotten, or sometimes even actively disliked or rejected.
Wow, that sounds like it would lead to strongly gender-typed behavior pretty early on, doesn't it? If you're constantly filtering and preferring stuff for your own group.
And that is a key difference from Kohlberg, and the source makes this very clear. Remember, Kohlberg said strong gender behavior is triggered after full constancy, around age 6 or later.
Right.
Schema theory argues it starts much earlier. As soon as these basic gender schemas start forming, which can be around ages 2 or 3, that filtering process begins.
So the moment they start creating those boy and girl mental folders, they start selectively paying attention and shaping their preferences.
That's the idea. The filtering drives the behavior early on.
Okay, so the timing is a major point of difference. What about the mechanism? What's actually driving the behavior according to this theory?
Well, Kohlberg said it's the abstract understanding of gender permanence that motivates behavior later on.
Right. Achieving constancy.
Schema theory says it's the selective information processing driven by the schema itself. It's the act of paying attention to, remembering, and valuing in-group information that shapes behavior and preferences right from a young age.
So it's the filtering process itself, not just the final understanding.
Exactly. And schema theory also seems, well, maybe better equipped to explain something Kohlberg's theory struggled with a bit: flexibility.
Ah, why people's views on gender roles might become less rigid later in life.
Yeah. Schema theory suggests that while these schemas are often quite rigid and stereotypical in early childhood, kids can be very black and white about it.
Oh, definitely.
They can become more complex and flexible over time. As cognitive abilities mature and as individuals encounter more varied experiences and information that might challenge those initial simple categories, the schemas themselves can adapt and change.
So it provides a mechanism for change and nuance later on.
It does offer a better explanation for that potential shift towards flexibility.
Okay, so schema theory builds on Piaget, brings in some social learning ideas, seems to address Kohlberg's issues with timing and maybe flexibility. What's the evidence look like for this one? Is it well supported?
There's actually quite good support, especially for that information processing bias. Martin and Halvorson themselves did a study in 1983. They showed children pictures
Yeah.
and found they had much better memory later for pictures that matched traditional gender stereotypes. Like they remembered a picture of a girl playing with dolls much better than a picture of a girl using tools.
Interesting. So memory itself is biased towards information that fits the schema.
That's what it suggests. It supports the idea that schemas guide what we encode and recall.
Okay, that's memory. Does it affect what kids actually do, their behavior?
Seems so. Brad Bard and colleagues did a study in 1986 where they had kids explore boxes filled with different toys, some stereotypically for boys, some for girls, some neutral.
Okay.
A week later, they asked the kids about the toys. The children remembered significantly more details about the toys that were stereotypically associated with their own gender.
So again, that in-group preference affecting recall about actual objects.
Yes. And then Martin and colleagues in 1995 took it a step further and just directly observed young kids, like 4- and 5-year-olds, during free play.
What did they see?
They found the kids strongly preferred and chose toys that fit their own gender schemas. Girls played more with girl toys, boys with boy toys. It shows the schemas influencing actual real-world behavior, not just memory in a lab task.
So that evidence seems pretty solid for the early influence of schemas on both memory and behavior. But like with Kohlberg, are there challenges or contradictory findings for schema theory too?
Oh, absolutely. The source highlights some important ones. For instance, a study by Campbell and colleagues in 2002 found something interesting.
What was that?
They found that how much a child knew about gender stereotypes, their awareness of them didn't actually strongly predict their own level of gender types behavior.
Huh. So just having the schema, knowing the stereotypes, doesn't automatically mean you're going to act in a super stereotypical way yourself?
Exactly. It raises a question. Is the schema the primary driver of behavior? Or are other factors, maybe temperament, parental influence, peer pressure, more important in determining how strongly a child adheres to those stereotypes?
That's a really important point. Knowing the map doesn't mean you follow the path exactly. And what about those very early preferences, the ones we said cognitive theories might struggle with?
Right. That brings us back to the Alexander et al. Study from 2009. This one is particularly challenging for any purely cognitive explanation, including schema theory.
The infant eye tracking one?
That's the one.
Yeah.
Using eye tracking with infants, some as young as 3 to 9 months old, looking at dolls versus trucks.
And they found.
Even at that incredibly young age, way before you could reasonably argue that complex cognitive schemas about gender have been fully developed through experience.
Yeah, they're just babies.
Boys look significantly longer at trucks, and girls look significantly longer at dolls.
Wow. So these visual preferences seem to exist almost from the get-go, before the cognitive filing systems could possibly be built.
That's what the data strongly suggests. It points towards earlier influences, possibly biological predispositions, or maybe very, very early subtle learning that might be at play before these elaborate cognitive schemas take hold.
That really forces you to question if cognition, whether it's Kohlberg stages or Martin and Halvorson schemas, is the only thing driving these early differences. It can't be the whole story.
Exactly. It underscores the need for a broader, more integrated perspective. It's not just about thinking.
So let's try and pull this together. We've got Kohlberg's stage theory and gender schema theory. If we put them side by side, what are the common threads and what are those crucial differences, again, that psych students really need to nail down?
Okay, common ground first. Both theories are fundamentally cognitive. They place the child's thinking processes right at the center of gender development.
Right, the mind matters.
Both agree that understanding develops over time, it's not static. And crucially, both see children as active constructors of their understanding. They aren't just passive sponges soaking up gender rules, they're actively trying to figure it out, make sense of it.
Got it. Active child, cognitive focus, developmental progression. But the differences are where it gets really interesting, especially for exams, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Let's recap those key distinctions. First, timing. When does strong gender-type behavior really kick in?
Kohlberg says after achieving gender constancy, so around age 6 or older.
Where schema theory says much earlier, around age 2 or 3, as soon as those basic schemas start forming and filtering information. Big difference.
Okay, timing.
A
Second,
proposed mechanism. What's driving the behavior?
Kohlberg emphasized the conceptual understanding getting that gender is permanent.
Schema theory emphasizes the ongoing selective information, processing the filtering, remembering, and valuing based on the in-group schema.
Different engines driving the train. And the third difference.
Flexibility. Schema theory seems to offer a better explanation for how gender roles and attitudes can become less rigid later in life, as schemas adapt and become more complex. Kohlberg's model is a bit more locked in once constancy is achieved.
Okay, those three, timing, mechanism, flexibility, seem like the core distinctions to remember. Now, stepping back even further, what about the strengths and weaknesses of cognitive approaches overall? What do they do well, and where do they fall short as a group?
Well, on the strengths side, the source notes, they do identify these seemingly universal patterns of development, like the stage sequence Kohlberg found, which holds up across different cultures, like in the Monroe study.
That's a plus. They also get credit for really highlighting the child's active role, right? Children aren't just being shaped, they're actively trying to make sense of things.
Definitely. And they offer a clear developmental perspective, linking changes in gender understanding to broader cognitive milestones and showing how it unfolds over time.
But the limitations are pretty significant too, as we've discussed.
They are. A major one is underestimating or often just ignoring biological factors. Those early infant preferences in the Alexander study are hard to explain with cognition alone.
Right. And while they find universal stages or processes, they don't always grapple well with the vast cultural variations in the content of gender roles.
Exactly. What it actually means to be a man or woman, the specific expectations, varies hugely across time and place. Cognitive theories focus more on the universal how of thinking, less on the variable what.
They also struggle a bit with individual differences, don't they? Why is one kid super stereotypical and another, even in the same family, much more flexible?
Yeah, cognitive theories don't offer a great explanation for that range of individual variation.
And maybe the biggest one is minimizing the day-to-day powerful influence of the social world peers, family reinforcement, media messages, that whole rich social context.
Precisely. While schema theory nods towards social learning by explaining how social information gets filtered, neither theory fully captures the dynamic, ongoing impact of the social environment in shaping gender.
So putting it all together, where does that leave us? What's the current view?
Well, the modern consensus view in developmental psychology, as the source correctly points out, is that gender development is incredibly complex. No single theory nails it completely.
It's not just cognition, not just biology, not just social learning.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's understood now as a dynamic interplay between all of these. Biological predispositions, cognitive processes like schema development and understanding constancy, the huge range of social experiences, and the broader cultural context they all happen within. It's multi-determined.
And understanding these cognitive pieces, even with their limitations, has real practical value, doesn't it? For teachers, for parents.
Absolutely. For educators, knowing that young children often operate with really rigid, simple gender schemas helps explain why they might say things that sound illogical or overly stereotypical to adults.
Like only boys can be firefighters.
Right. Understanding that rigidity is linked to their cognitive stage helps teachers know they might need to actively introduce counter-stereotypes, showcase diversity, and gently encourage exploration across traditional gender lines.
And for parents.
Recognizing these cognitive stages can be reassuring. That intense gender rigidity you might see in a 4-year-old. Often it's a normal phase tied to their current thinking abilities.
So parents don't need to panic that their kid will be stuck in that phase forever.
Exactly. It allows them to be patient, to understand it's a developmental, and to trust that as the child's thinking matures, their views on gender roles can become more flexible. It encourages parents to provide diverse experiences and opportunities without feeling like they're fighting against some fixed trait.
This is all fantastic context, especially, as we said, for psychology students trying to get a handle on this for exams. The source even has that key takeaways for exam success section. Let's quickly hit those absolute must-knows.
Okay, laser-focused time for students. You absolutely must know Kohlberg's 3 stages by name: gender identity, gender stability, gender constancy.
And the rough ages, 2, 3, 4, 7, 6 plus day. But remember that critique about constancy maybe being a bit earlier?
Yes, know the critique too. Then for schema theory, you need to define gender schema clearly and explain that in-group, out-group processing bias, how kids filter information.
And definitely be able to nail that critical difference from Kohlberg about when strong gender-type behavior kicks in, according to schema theory, much earlier.
Crucial. Then, the key studies. You should be able to name and briefly explain the main findings of Thompson, stage 1 timing;
Slaby and Frey, the sequence support, but also the earlier constancy timing and the sex differences finding.
Monroe et al., that cross-cultural support for the sequence;
Martin and Halverson and Martin et al. Showing schema influence on memory and behavior.
and definitely the Alexander et al. Infant eye tracking study is a key piece of evidence challenging purely cognitive views by suggesting earlier influences.
Got it. Studies are key. And don't forget the evaluation points we discussed. Strengths and limitations of cognitive approaches overall.
Right. Be ready to discuss the strengths, universality, active child role, developmental perspective, and the limitations ignoring biology, downplaying social context and individual differences, not fully handling cultural variations.
Perfect. And finally, practice applying them.
Yes. The source likely includes scenarios. Think about how you'd use Kohlberg and schema theory to explain, say, a 4-year-old's rigid views versus a 7-year-old's more flexible play. And how would a modern integrated perspective add layers to that explanation? Application shows real understanding.
Okay, wow. We have really covered a lot of ground on the cognitive side of gender development. We started with Piaget's building blocks, how thinking itself changes.
Then mapped out Kohlberg's stages, identity, stability, constancy, and his idea about understanding driving motivation.
And then contrasted that with gender schema theory, focusing on those mental filters, the in-group bias, and that earlier start for gendered behavior.
Yeah, we've explored the research, the evidence supporting these ideas, but also, importantly, shown a light on where they fall short. maybe underestimating biology right from the start, or the sheer complexity of the social world kids live in.
It's crystal clear that how children think about gender is absolutely a core piece of this puzzle. But like you said, it's just one piece of a much larger interwoven system of biological, social, and cultural influences.
Absolutely. So, maybe something to leave you thinking about, especially in our current society. If children naturally build these cognitive schemas based on the gender categories and information they encounter, what happens when those societal categories themselves are shifting, expanding, being questioned?
A good question.
How does a child's sort of natural cognitive tendency to categorize and simplify interact with a social reality that's becoming potentially more fluid and diverse? How might those schemas evolve in response? And how does that interact with the underlying developmental process Kohlberg described? Lots to consider there.
That's definitely something to mull over. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the mind's role in understanding gender.